The rain fell in a steady, relentless drizzle, soaking through the heavy coats and umbrellas of the mourners gathered around Detective Lucas Morgan's casket. It wasn't the kind of dramatic storm you might expect at the funeral of a hero. No crack of thunder, no flashes of lightning, just a persistent, mournful rain that seemed to seep into every bone and heart present. Rows of uniformed officers stood stiffly, their badges glinting dully in the gray light. Friends, family, and community members packed the cemetery grounds, all drawn together by the same shared loss. The police honor guard formed a somber line, white-gloved hands gripping flags and rifles that seemed almost too ceremonial for the depth of pain etched into the faces around them. At the head of it all stood a black German shepherd, sitting perfectly still by the casket as if on duty even now. Shadow. Lucas's K9 partner, his friend, his guardian. His fur was slick with rain, ears twitching every so often, eyes locked forward with a focus that spoke volumes about the bond he had shared with his handler. Lucas had been one of the best, fearless, sharp, respected by all who knew him. His sudden death in a violent gang shootout had rocked the entire department, the city even. The loss of Lucas was more than a tragedy. It felt like the tearing away of something vital and good from the world. The priest, voice low and unsteady, spoke of sacrifice, of honor, of duty. Each word fell into the silence like stones dropped into a deep well, sinking, leaving ripples of grief behind. Mothers clutched tissues to their faces. Officers bowed their heads, their mouths tight with the effort to keep from breaking. Shadow remained unmoving, a sentinel in black fur, but if anyone had been watching closely, they might have noticed the subtle tension in his posture, the barely perceptible tremor that traveled down his spine. And then, through that thick grief-laden air, something happened. Something no one expected. At first, it was just a shift, a low whine vibrating in Shadow's throat. His ears pinned back, and his nose lifted slightly as if catching a scent that didn't belong. The priest paused, glancing briefly at the dog, but continued. Then came the bark, sharp, piercing, splitting the air like a knife. Heads turned. Murmurs flickered through the crowd. An officer near the front frowned, tugging gently on Shadow's leash. "Easy, boy," he whispered under his breath. "Not now." But Shadow wouldn't be calmed. His body went rigid, his tail stiff, his gaze boring into the casket with an intensity that sent an involuntary shudder down more than one spine in the crowd. Another bark, louder this time, echoed through the cemetery. It was not aggression. It was something else entirely: urgency, fear, desperation. The mourners began to shift uncomfortably. Was it grief? Confusion? Could animals even sense something wrong, some whispered wrongness in the world? The police chief, standing near the front with his hat held respectfully against his chest, scowled and gestured at the handler. "Control the animal," he hissed under his breath. But there was no controlling Shadow now. Some invisible line had been crossed, and the dog knew that something about this ceremony was terribly, terribly wrong. In one sudden, fluid motion, Shadow yanked the leash out of the officer's hand, bolts of muscle driving him forward. "Shadow!" the handler called sharply, but the dog wasn't listening. He sprinted across the sodden grass, rain streaming off his coat, straight toward the casket. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Evelyn Morgan, Lucas's mother, instinctively clutched at her son David's arm, her fingers digging in. Shadow lunged at the coffin, his paws scraping across the polished wood, nails gouging deep scratches into its pristine surface. He barked again, a sound filled with almost human anguish, then began pawing and scratching at the lid as if trying to tear it open with sheer force. "Get him!" barked the chief, stepping forward himself now. Several officers rushed toward Shadow, but hesitated when they saw the raw desperation in his actions. Shadow wasn't attacking the casket. He wasn't confused or panicked. He was trying to save something, or someone. Evelyn, trembling, turned her tear-streaked face up to the police chief. "What's happening?" she whispered. "What's wrong?" Shadow whined, circled the casket, barked again. His body language spoke volumes no human could yet decipher, not without seeing what he already knew. And then a voice, clear and firm, cut through the growing din. "Open it!" Heads turned. David Morgan stood there, his jaw set, his fists clenched at his sides. His face was pale, almost waxy, but his eyes burned with a grim certainty. The police chief stiffened. "David, I understand you're upset." "Open it," David repeated, louder this time, cutting through the gathering murmurs. "Something's wrong. Shadow knows." "You don't understand," the chief said carefully, lowering his voice as if trying not to embarrass the grieving family further. "Lucas's injuries. The coroner. It's not going to be easy to—" "I don't care," David barked, emotion cracking his voice. He took a step forward, standing between the crowd and the casket, shielding Shadow with his own body. "We owe it to Lucas. To Shadow. Open it." A tense silence gripped the cemetery. For a long moment, the chief simply stared at him, then, reluctantly, nodded. "Fine," he said, his voice grim. "But be prepared for what you'll see." Two officers stepped forward, each placing a hand on the lid. As they began to lift it, the world seemed to hold its breath. Evelyn sobbed softly, covering her mouth with shaking hands. The lid creaked open, revealing the figure inside. A gasp ripped through the mourners, followed almost immediately by screams. Evelyn let out a raw, broken wail and stumbled backward into David, who barely caught her. Officers instinctively reached for their weapons, their eyes wide with horror. Because the man lying in the casket was not Lucas Morgan. The features were wrong, the nose, the chin, the hairline. Even through the cosmetic efforts of the mortician, it was clear to anyone who knew Lucas that this body was someone else entirely. The realization struck with the force of a hammer. Lucas wasn't dead. Shadow, now silent, sat back on his haunches and wagged his tail once, a single satisfied thump against the wet grass, as if to say, "Finally. You see now." Chaos exploded around the gravesite. Officers sprinted for their radios, barking into them with urgent reports. The funeral was immediately shut down, civilians ushered away. The chief, pale as a ghost, barked orders at the stunned staff. "Get the hospital on the line. Get the coroner's office. Find out what the hell happened." In the eye of the storm, David knelt beside Shadow, burying his face into the dog's wet fur, whispering, "Thank you. Thank you for not giving up." Somewhere in the back of everyone's mind, a single terrible question began to form. If Lucas wasn't in that casket, where was he now? For a few long seconds after the casket was opened and the horrifying mistake revealed, no one moved, except Shadow. The moment the lid lifted and the imposter's face was exposed, Shadow's entire body relaxed. The fierce tension drained from his muscles, his hackles smoothed, and the deep growl that had been rumbling in his chest faded into silence. He sat back on his haunches with a soft, almost relieved sigh. His tail wagged once, a slow, heavy thud against the wet ground, then again, lighter this time. He had done his duty. His partner was not here, not in this box, not buried in sorrow and lies. Somehow, deep inside his loyal heart, he had known the truth even when none of the humans could see it. David knelt beside him, wrapping his arms around the dog's neck. Shadow leaned into him, allowing the embrace, his amber eyes watching the chaos that unfolded around them with quiet certainty. He had sounded the alarm. Now it was up to the humans to fix what was broken. The cemetery exploded into motion. Officers barked orders into radios, calling for backup, investigators, anyone who could help make sense of this nightmare. The funeral director stumbled away from the scene, pale and shaking. Family members cried out in confusion and fear, ushered toward waiting police cars for safety and answers. The police chief, hat forgotten in his hand, spun toward the officers still gathered in a stunned circle. "Lock this area down," he snapped. "No one leaves until we know exactly how this happened. I want that casket secured, photographed, processed as a crime scene." "Yes, sir." Officers fanned out, moving with grim efficiency. The honor guard lowered their rifles, no longer part of a solemn ceremony but soldiers in the midst of a terrible discovery. Shadow stayed close to David's side, his eyes flicking from face to face, ever alert. In the chaos, Evelyn Morgan sat numbly in the back of a cruiser, clutching a soaked handkerchief in her trembling hands. She stared out through the rain-speckled window, mouthing her son's name over and over again like a prayer. David stood tall despite the weight of grief threatening to crush him. Somewhere, deep inside, hope was beginning to bloom. If Lucas wasn't here, maybe he was still alive. But where? And how much time did they have left? It didn't take long for the investigators to trace the problem back to the night of the shootout. Amid the chaos of flashing sirens, frantic paramedics, and overwhelmed ER staff, 2 critical patients had been rushed into the trauma unit: Detective Lucas Morgan and Officer Dean Hall. Both had been shot multiple times. Both were barely clinging to life. Blood soaked their uniforms, their faces bruised and battered beyond easy recognition. In the hours that followed, one of the men succumbed to his wounds. In the rush to notify next of kin, exhausted hospital staff had made a terrible mistake. They had misidentified the bodies. Lucas, unconscious and gravely injured but still alive, had been tagged as the deceased. Dean Hall, the officer who had died, had been mistakenly declared the survivor. It wasn't until the casket was opened that anyone realized the horrifying truth. An internal memo, hastily compiled by hospital administrators, confirmed the worst: Lucas Morgan was not dead. He had been lying unidentified in a coma in a recovery ward for over a week. The realization hit the department like a sledgehammer. Shock turned to rage. Phone lines burned with furious calls. Hospital administrators scrambled to explain, to apologize, to beg for understanding. But it was too late. Human error had nearly cost Lucas Morgan his life, and buried the truth alongside a man he had called a brother. Without hesitation, Chief Reynolds ordered a full police escort to the hospital. Sirens split the rain-drenched afternoon as squad cars tore through the city streets. David rode with them, Shadow pressed close against his side in the back seat, both of them silent, both of them bracing for whatever they would find. When they burst through the hospital's emergency entrance, staff were already waiting. The head trauma nurse, pale and sweating, led them down a series of sterile white corridors that seemed to stretch forever. Finally, they reached a door marked ICU 3. David's heart hammered in his chest. His hands shook. The nurse pushed the door open. And there, lying motionless in a hospital bed surrounded by blinking machines, was Lucas Morgan. Tubes snaked from his arms and nose. His face was bruised, swollen. His chest rose and fell with the mechanical rhythm of a ventilator. But it was him. David staggered forward, clinging to the doorframe for support. Shadow crept to the bedside, resting his head gently against the mattress, his ears flat against his skull in silent mourning. "Lucas!" David choked out, tears burning his eyes. "You're alive." The doctors warned them to be cautious, that Lucas's injuries were severe, his prognosis uncertain. But in that moment, none of it mattered. Against impossible odds, Lucas had survived. And somehow, impossibly, Shadow had known it all along. The days that followed blurred into a haze of waiting. David sat at Lucas's bedside, recounting stories of their childhood, their academy days, their late-night talks. He told him about the funeral that hadn't been his, about Shadow's heroism, about the hope that now burned in all of them because of one dog's stubborn refusal to accept what the world said was true. Evelyn visited every morning, whispering prayers into her son's ear, holding his hand until her own went numb. Shadow refused to leave the hospital, sleeping curled up beneath Lucas's bed, a silent guardian. Nurses who tried to move him were met with low, warning growls and wisely left him alone. No one knew if Lucas could hear them. No one knew if he was fighting somewhere deep inside his shattered body. But they hoped. And when the doctors spoke of brain activity, when they whispered about possible improvements, David clung to every word like a lifeline. Lucas Morgan was alive. He wasn't gone yet. And they weren't about to give up on him. 2 weeks. 14 days of uncertainty, silent prayers, and endless waiting. Then, without warning, it happened. David had fallen asleep in the chair beside the hospital bed, a blanket draped haphazardly over his shoulders. Evelyn sat knitting quietly by the window, her movements slow and mechanical. Shadow, ever vigilant, lifted his head first. He stared at Lucas's face, ears pricking sharply. A low whine escaped him, soft, questioning. David stirred, rubbing sleep from his eyes just in time to see Lucas's fingers twitch. For a moment, he thought he had imagined it. But then Lucas's hand moved again, more deliberately this time, as if reaching for something. "Mom!" David shouted, scrambling to his feet. "Get the doctor!" "No!" The room exploded into motion. Evelyn rushed into the hallway, calling for help. Nurses stormed in, adjusting monitors, checking vitals. A doctor appeared, scanning the readouts with practiced urgency. Lucas's eyes fluttered open, not fully, but enough for a sliver of green to show through. His breathing quickened, and he tried to speak, but the ventilator made it impossible. Tears streamed down David's face. "You're okay," he whispered fiercely, clutching his brother's hand. "You're safe. You're alive." Shadow let out a bark, sharp, joyous, and leapt to his feet, his tail wagging furiously. Lucas was back. Against every odd, against every mistake and misstep, he had found his way home. It was days later, once Lucas's breathing tube was removed and his voice returned in hoarse, broken whispers, that David sat beside him and told him the whole story. The funeral, the casket, the mistake, and Shadow, how the dog had refused to accept his death, how his loyalty had cracked open the lie they had all unknowingly built around Lucas's absence. Lucas listened in stunned silence. At first, he thought it had to be a dream. Some fevered nightmare conjured by pain and medication. But when Shadow leapt up onto his hospital bed, nuzzling his chest with a low, vibrating purr of joy, the truth sank in. He reached up with trembling fingers and buried them into Shadow's thick black fur. "You saved me," he croaked, tears filling his eyes. "You stubborn, brilliant boy. You saved my life." Shadow licked his hand, then settled against him, heart to heart, as if to say, "I was never going to let you go." The bond between them, already strong, had been reforged in fire, stronger, deeper, and unbreakable. Lucas vowed then and there that he would spend the rest of his life honoring that loyalty. Meanwhile, back at the precinct and hospital administration offices, the fallout from the catastrophic misidentification was just beginning. The city launched a full-scale investigation. Why had protocols failed? Who had authorized the death certificate without proper verification? How had the hospital lost track of one of its own? The answers weren't simple. Overwork, exhaustion, staff shortages, chaos during a mass casualty event. But excuses weren't good enough. Several hospital staff members were placed on administrative leave pending review. New emergency identification protocols were immediately drafted and implemented, including double verification systems and mandatory photographic ID checks. The police department also initiated its own reforms. Funeral procedures were revised. Chain of custody paperwork for deceased officers was overhauled. No family would ever again suffer the anguish of a false death notification. Lucas's story wasn't just a tragedy narrowly averted, it became a catalyst for systemic change, a harsh reminder that even the best intentions can go horribly wrong without vigilance. Shadow, of course, received official recognition for his actions. The department awarded him the Medal of Valor, an honor rarely given to a K-9 officer, and a ceremony was planned for when Lucas was strong enough to attend. Everyone knew. None of these changes, none of these second chances, would have been possible without one determined dog who refused to let the truth stay buried. Rehabilitation was slow, painful, grueling. Lucas had to relearn simple things, standing, walking, even speaking without slurring from his injuries. His body bore the scars of the shootout, his mind the weight of the death he had narrowly escaped and the brotherhood he had nearly lost. But every step he took, every small victory, was matched by Shadow's unwavering presence. When Lucas struggled to move, Shadow nudged him gently forward. When frustration boiled over into rage and despair, Shadow was there, a steady, calming weight against his leg. They healed together. And when, 6 months later, Lucas walked back into the precinct, leaner, scarred, but burning with new fire, Shadow trotted proudly beside him, tail wagging, head held high. The room erupted into applause. Tears shone openly in the eyes of men and women who had buried a friend and now welcomed a brother reborn. Chief Reynolds pinned a new badge onto Lucas's uniform himself, clapping him on the shoulder with trembling hands. "Welcome home, detective," he said thickly. "We missed you." And this time, Lucas knew, no mistake would ever steal him away again. In the months that followed, Lucas and Shadow's story became legend. It was whispered in squad rooms late at night, shared at police academies during lessons about crisis protocols. New recruits were taught not only about procedure but about vigilance, and about the deep, intuitive loyalty that sometimes exceeds human reason. New training modules were named after Lucas Morgan. K-9 units across the country cited Shadow's actions as a case study in the extraordinary capabilities of working dogs. Reporters flocked for interviews, but Lucas declined most of them. This wasn't about fame. It was about gratitude, for second chances, for the love of family, For the faith of one loyal partner who had refused to give up. When asked what he had learned through it all, Lucas said simply, "Trust your instincts. Trust your dog. And never, ever assume you know the full story until you look with your own eyes." He would never forget the look in Shadow's eyes that rainy afternoon, the desperate, urgent bark that had shattered the false world they all lived in. One bark had rewritten destiny. One bond had saved a life. One dog had refused to mourn until he knew the truth. And because of that, a hero walked among them still, not just on 2 legs, but 4.